I hope that everything I have explained in relation to the syllabus, the forums, tests, all the requirements, as well as the general direction of this class is clear by now. Time to start the first lecture then. It's going to be shorter than usual, and I will take you through a bit of introductory issues related to basically how we want to deal with the topics we concentrate on in this class. I will begin by showing you something you may be familiar with. I'm actually interested in knowing whether you have seen this before. And of course I would like to ask you whether these are Chinese characters or not. Are they? Do they look like Chinese characters? So do we have, what are the reasons why this looks like Chinese characters? They do seem to proceed systematically, right? You do recognize elements that repeat themselves just like in actual characters. You do notice the colors, just like in a traditional book. The way the text proceeds does look like in a traditional text. It seems to start from the right. You do have a seal-looking red ink thing over here. You do have other typographic marks that seem to come from traditional or look like those in traditional texts. And yet, of course, they are not Chinese characters. They are, in fact, a piece of art. Its producer is this man, an artist from China whose name is Xu Bing, who had a wonderful exhibition in Taipei as well 3 years ago. This comes from his work, which is very, very large, and which is known as a book from the sky. Tianshu. It's really, really, really large, and it's basically a collection of many, many, many texts looking just like this. Now, Xu Bing basically invented something that looks like Chinese characters, and then he proceeded to produce books that look Chinese, that feel Chinese, and yet they are not. This is where we are in this class, in this territory. We are in a place that looks Chinese, feels Chinese, but is not real China. It's the China of the imagination, is the China of the mind. We ourselves are in a Xu Bing-like world. Now, don't imagine that Xu Bing stopped with this, with Chinese-looking characters. He also did this. Now tell me, what is this? Is it Chinese? Nah. Does it look Chinese? 一点点. But maybe it isn't, is it? Try to read it, can you? Oh, come on. The T-H-E. Apparition. A-P-P-A-R-I-T-I-O-N. Of. These. T-H-E-S-E. The apparition of these faces in the crowd. Of these faces in the crowd. Petals on a wet black bow. And then the title of the poem, because this is what it is, in a station of the metro. Poem by Ezra Pound. calligraphy, this is calligraphy, the word, by Xu Ping. This is the so-called English writing. So this is another experiment by Xu Ping. This time I chose it because he himself chose to reproduce in this particular spelling, in this particular calligraphy, one of the most famous texts of modernism. The text is indeed in a station of the metro. Its author is Ezra Pound. And everybody who has taken a course in English or American literature will have studied this at quite some length. It's a very, very famous poem from the 1910s. And we will be talking about Ezra Pound and the influence of Chinese, or rather his imaginary Chinese, on his poetry and hence on modernism at large at some point in our class. Many people, you may or may not know that Ezra Pound was also a translator of very important texts from Chinese, including the Dialectics by Confucius, and also the Ta Xue and the Zhongyong. Was he a translator though, or not? Many people keep on saying that he had no idea what he was talking about, that he knew no Chinese. But then again, somebody else will come and say, does it matter when his translations sound much better, at least to some ears, than the translations made by professional sinologists at about the same time? To put it otherwise, is misunderstanding such a bad thing when its cultural contribution is so important? These are issues that will appear all the time in our discussion. Because we, once again, are or will be in this class somewhere in between reality, whatever that is, and representation, between what we know as historical fact and the perception of those facts, between correctness and very fertile misunderstanding, and so on and so forth. Please keep all these things in mind as we proceed. I use these slides as a game rather than for any other purpose. If you have time, do study a bit more, do learn a bit more about Xu Ping. There is going to be a forum, in fact, dedicated to Xu Ping. The very first forum for this class is going to take you there. And trust me, we will be talking about Ezra Pound and Ernest Fenollosa, the person whose very important text on Chinese poetry, he influenced him so much. Right, from Fenollosa to something else. What's this? Come on, you know it? Yay! I knew you would know that. Who doesn't know unicorns, right? My children also love to play with whatever little, you know, the pink one I think is very popular these days.
Was that a pony?
So, unicorns. We'll be talking about unicorns for about half an hour. Why is it that we, well, of course, because we love them. But apart from this, let's go together a bit through what we see here. All the images come from a French site, so I reproduce the text in French and the information next to them. And as we move on, we can comment a bit. Now, this comes from an exhibition dedicated to reproductions of the unicorn in Western texts. This is a late text, but it refers to antiquity. We see here Orpheus charming the animals through his, or taming the animals through his song. And this is a good opportunity for the authors of this site to introduce us to the image of the unicorn in classical times in Greece and Rome. He reminds us, or she reminds us, the authors of this site, a site of the National Library of France, about the fact that we find an early mention of the unicorn with Pliny, that is, with the 1st century in the Christian era, and the unicorn is supposed or is described as coming from India and is a composite animal. It is supposed to have the head of a horse, to have the body of a horse, the head of a stag, elephant-like paws, and the tail of a bull. Also, the horn is supposed to be black. This is the earliest representation we have of the unicorn. Not yet quite the animal we imagine to know, which, by the way, how would you describe? What would the unicorn look like? Don't tell me pink. Give me something else. So what's it supposed to look like? What color? Any color? White, huh? And the horn? Okay. Okay. Nice animal? Kind? Yeah. Anything? No, not nice. Really? Dangerous? I think rather nice, right? How about the composite body? Is it a horse? Yeah. So nothing like elephants and stags and boars and something like this, right? So basically a kind of meek, nice horse with one beautiful horn, right, on its forehead. We are here a bit later. We are already in the Middle Ages, and we see the white thing you mentioned, looking like a horse with a beautiful golden horn. This is part of an illuminated letter in a medieval manuscript dating from the 13th century. It was not only the Greeks that produced and Romans that produced the medieval image of the unicorn. The Bible and early Christians also contributed to the medieval understanding of the unicorn, however, not in ways we might expect. Probably because of some mistake, not probably, quite likely because of some mistake made in the translation of the Bible from Hebrew into Greek. Into Latin. Unicorn does appear in this very early version of the Bible known as the Vulgate. And there, the unicorn is supposed to be a very violent and certainly ill-intentioned animal. It is in fact compared to a demon by early Christian fathers. So the image that early Christians had of the unicorn was closer to the one of danger that you yourselves mentioned a bit earlier. However, this was not going to stay. And simultaneously, a different model appeared. We find it in a text known as the Physiologus, which is something like a bestiary. A bestiary is a medieval text dedicated to descriptions of animals. Now, the Physiologus is a much earlier text produced around the 2nd, 3rd century, I don't remember exactly, which functioned as a model for later medieval texts known as bestiaries. Here, we find a description of the unicorn that is closer to the one you have just given me. Basically, the animal is rather mild and gentle and meek, just as you told me. Also small, not something very large and impressive. Also, something that you have not mentioned, but which came to dominate the minds of the medieval people, the time when unicorns were so much of a favorite in the European mind. The fact that unicorns, even while small, are difficult to capture. They cannot be captured easily, and sheer power is not enough. Instead, something else is needed. They needed to be tricked into staying. And the trick that works is asking a young virgin woman to call for the unicorn. The unicorn is going to be impressed and come and lay his head in her lap, and then and only then will the hunters be able to catch it. So this is how this essential element in unicorn lore was already articulated in early Christian times. So let's review it again. An animal that is very nice, very kind, but which does not let itself be captured easily by hunters. Hunters need to capture it by asking a young virgin to call the unicorn, who will then peacefully lay his head in her lap so that hunters can come and kill it. We have this image of the virgin woman attracting the unicorn. Well, looks like a wolf to me, but with a huge horn. And hunters repeated constantly in medieval texts. This soon came to be interpreted symbolically. By the way, if you read French, there's a lot of extra text that is left on the right and on the left. You don't need to, I'm not going to focus on it, but you can certainly read it by yourself. For instance, here you have a beautiful poem by a medieval king and also poet about the symbolism of the unicorn. Now, as I said a bit earlier, it didn't last long before Europeans started to create an analogy or started to interpret this vision of the unicorn coming to a virgin and being killed symbolically. Basically, they started to think of the unicorn as Jesus, whose sacrifice, whose passion, death, is represented through the hunt of the unicorn. And for a while, they interpreted the image of the Virgin not as Virgin Mary, as we might expect, but rather as an image of the incarnation of Jesus, of God incarnated as human. So Jesus is both the unicorn and the Virgin. So this was an early Christian allegory that would, however, develop into something more common or more easier to expect. This is from a bestiary by Pierre de Beauvais, and the text runs like this: Our Lord Jesus Christ, a heavenly unicorn. So the heavenly unicorn, Jesus the heavenly unicorn, descended to the breast of the Virgin. So this time it's a capital V for the Virgin. So this is Virgin Mary, Jesus' mother, and suffered for our sake. You have the whole text continuing and explaining this idea. The full allegory appears here. Notice also that this is very, very obvious. We actually see Virgin Mary, we see baby Jesus and the unicorn as a symbol of baby Jesus. Now, an exact explanation of this was also put into words on in a larger passage in another 12th century bestiary. This goes like this: Monoceros, or the unicorn, is an animal which has one horn on its head, therefore it is so named. It is the form of a goat rather than that of a horse. It is caught by means of a virgin. Now here, in what manner? And then you have the description, what exactly happened, right? How the virgin attracts the unicorn and so on and so forth. Note one interesting thing here is that basically the virgin woman does not call for the unicorn, but rather her smell, her odor attracts the unicorn. This was a topic they often wrote about. And then the allegory, the allegorical interpretation. Monoceros is Greek, it's a Greek word. It means one horn in French. A beast of such a description signifies Jesus Christ. One God, he is and shall be, and was and will continue so. He placed himself in the virgin and took flesh for man's sake and for virginity to show chastity. To a virgin he appeared and the virgin conceived him. A virgin she is and will be and will remains always. Now here briefly the signification. This animal in truth signifies God. Know that the virgin signifies Saint Mary. By her breast we understand similarly the Holy Church. And then by the kiss it ought to signify, because the virgin here is described as kissing the unicorn, that a man when he sleeps is in semblance of death. God slept as a man who suffered death on the cross, and so on and so forth. So we have here the allegory fully described. We have it described in similar manner in several other texts. This is another one that I will not get into much detail. By a bit later, bestiary. Now notice that the title of this text is Bestiaire d'amour. So it's a bestiary of love. And here we start having an association between the unicorn and something else. While the association with Christian symbols does remain, we are also moving in a different direction. This whole process here, whereby the unicorn is attracted to the virgin, is similar to what was known in the 12th or 13th century as courtly love. A passion, a pure passion that a knight would have one of the noble ladies at the court of his lord. So what becomes more important in this image of the unicorn is purity and chastity of love. So the image stops being connected only with Christian symbols, and it also acquires a meaning related to love. Notice the word capitalized several times over here. If you want to understand more about this, you will need to read the text by yourselves. Trust me, it's not going to be difficult. This gets repeated over and over, and in later times we see the combination of the Christian message and the culture of the aristocratic noble courts in Western Europe, mostly in France and England and Germany, appearing in some of the most beautiful objects related to unicorns. These are tapestries, and we have several series of tapestries produced in northern France and in Flanders or the Netherlands in the 15th and early 16th century. One such series of tapestries can be found at the Metropolitan Museum, the cloisters, the medieval area of the Met, and the title of the series is The Hunt of the Unicorn. There are 6, I think, or 7 of them. Here we have the image of the unicorn being found. The titles are given by scholars, but notice the much more complicated social environment where the finding of the unicorn happens, right? We don't have just a hunter and a virgin, but rather a much more complicated court-related kind of context. We can see this here as well. The unicorn is attacked. That's another tapestry in the series. And then yet another one, my favorite. The unicorn is in captivity and no longer dead. Somehow the unicorn seems to have made it back to life. They are stunningly beautiful. The colors are much more beautiful than what you can see here, but that's the best quality reproduction I could find. A similar series, just as stunning, was produced in around 1500 and is now sheltered in the Musée National du Moyen Âge in Paris. This is the series known as the Lady and the Unicorn, and notice the powerful and very, very beautiful symbolism that you can find here. You see the lady, you see the unicorn, you see the something that looks very much like heraldry, all those medieval symbols showing power, showing nobility, the flags, everything is here, suggesting the important role of the unicorn in the medieval imagination. Again, just a few images over here. They all, the series of tapestries associated with senses. So each of these connects to one of our senses, smell and touch and hearing and so on and so forth. And here is finally the unicorn as you imagined it, I suppose, a bit earlier, right? So the nice looking white one-horned animal that we talked about. The meaning of, or the idea of chastity and purity gets further represented. I will skip through this. We will also find the unicorn, a new idea appearing at about the same time, the unicorn being able to purify waters through its horn. Here we have the two images combined, the lady, the unicorn, and the horn purifying waters. All these ideas of chastity, purity come together. There's so much that we can talk about it, but this is not the point. You will see the point in just 1 second. One or two more images. Unicorn in heraldry. Notice what this valiant knight on a horse is wearing on his head. A unicorn shaped helmet. Finally, probably the best known and quite famous painting by Raphael, the lady with a unicorn, available in Rome. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with this very, very beautiful painting. And finally, Marco Polo, because all this discussion about unicorns was meant to take us here. This is Marco Polo, represented as traveling to Asia, and here are his travels where he describes a unicorn. Now let's see what Marco, the Italian, quite young yet, traveler on his way back from China to Italy, had to say about a unicorn he saw in Java and Sumatra. There they have wild elephants and plenty of unicorns.
Are scarcely smaller than elephants.
They have the hair of a buffalo and feet like an elephant's. Hair of a buffalo, feet like elephants. They have a single large black horn in the middle of the forehead. They do not attack with their horn, but only with their tongue and their knees, for their tongues are furnished with long, sharp spines, so that when they want to do any harm to anyone, they first crush him by kneeling upon him and then lacerate him with their tongues. This, okay. They have a head like a wild boar's and always carry it stooped towards the ground. They spend their time by preference wallowing in mud and slime. They are very ugly brutes to look at. They are not at all such as we describe them when we relate that they let themselves be captured by virgins, but clean contrary
To our notions.
Did he really see a unicorn? What did he see? A rhinoceros, of course. That's what he saw. He did describe it as a rhinoceros, right? This is what we would understand. Marco Polo's text was one of the most popular texts in the Middle Ages, and it was reproduced in manuscript forms many, many times. One of the most beautiful such manuscript is housed at the National Library in France. It's the famous manuscript 2810, which is a collection of texts related to wonderful travels. This passage is illustrated by this. So, the person illustrating the text decided to show a rhinoceros, or rather a unicorn. So notice that there is absolutely no connection between Marco Polo's unicorn and what the words describe and what the image shows. Why is this? Well, because everybody knows what a unicorn is. A unicorn is this. And so it should stay, no matter what other pieces of information come. This is what I mean when I mention on the very last, as the very last topic in the course description, the lingering power of images. This is one illustration about this. Now let's find a better reader of all this unicorn lore, and this better reader is a man I love. His name is Umberto Eco. The passages that we will read together come from a book known as Serendipities, Language and Lunacy. It's a text that Eco, as a semioticician and writer, some of you may be familiar with The Name of the Rose, for instance, put together in the 90s, dedicated to issues of language. Hence, this is the cover of the book, an illustration of the Tower of Babel and the problems that language and the multiplicity of language produced in the minds of 17th century Europeans. Now, Eco, I will discuss about 3 pages from this book. Now, Eco talks about Marco Polo and unicorns in order to discuss how cultures come together. He talks about how 2 cultures meet and the shock that comes from this meeting, and the 3 possibilities, the 3 major possibilities he foresees as appearing in the wake of such contact. He believes that one consequence of a meeting of cultures is conquest. So one civilization, culture A, cannot really recognize culture B as normal human beings. Rather, it calls them barbarians, or people that are not worthy of being fully human. So they decide to either colonize, to civilize them, or to fully destroy them. And this, historically, is the way Eco believes in which Europeans behaved with various African and South American or American cultures. Another possibility when 2 cultures meet is that of cultural pillage or stealing. Culture A recognizes that culture B has some wisdom, unknown wisdom, stuff that is interesting and exciting. They may wish and they may try to conquer culture B, but at the same time they respect its culture and they try to adapt it and adopt parts of it. For example, he gives an example of the relationship between Greece and Egypt. And finally, he imagines exchange as a possibility. This is a 2-way process in which culture A and culture B influence each other and respect each other, and this is how he thinks that the early contacts between China and Europe happened. He gives an example of Marco Polo. He also gives he makes an example out of Matteo Ricci, and he illustrates this with the constant bickering between Italians and Chinese as to who really invented spaghetti. Now, he's careful to continue by reminding us that these are abstract models, and also that there are quite many other cases where such contacts, many other ways that such contacts happened historically. He mentions the possibility of exoticism, he mentions the possibility of bricolage or aesthetic bricolage and interpretation, chinoiserie, and so on and so forth. Now, he continues a bit along these lines, but we are not interested in them. What we are interested in is the next paragraph. So let's read it. We, in the sense of human beings, travel and explore the world, carrying with us some background books. These need not accompany us physically. The point is that we travel with preconceived notions of the world derived from our cultural tradition. In a very curious sense, we travel knowing in advance what we are on the verge of discovering, because past reading had told us what we are supposed to discover. In other words, the influence of these background books is such that irrespective of what travelers discover and see, they will interpret and explain everything in terms of these books. We are this. This is a famous painting by Arcimboldo, a man made of books, right? The librarian. We are made of our own books. An immediate discussion of the Marco Polo example comes next. When Marco traveled to China, he was obviously looking for unicorns. Marco was a merchant, not an intellectual, and moreover, when he started traveling, he was too young to have read many books. But he certainly knew all the legends current in his time about exotic countries. So he was prepared to encounter unicorns, and he looked for them. On his way home in Java, he saw some animals that resembled unicorns because they had a single horn on their muzzles, and because an entire tradition had prepared him to see unicorns. So he identified these animals as unicorns. But because he was naive and honest, he could not refrain from telling the truth. And the truth was that the unicorns he saw were very different from those represented by millennial tradition. They were not white, but black. They had pelts like buffalo, and their hooves were as big as elephants. Their horns too were not white but black. Their tongues were spiky, and their heads looked like wild boars. In fact, what Marco saw was the rhinoceros. We cannot say that Marco lied. He told the simple truth, namely that unicorns were not the gentle beasts people believed them to be. But he was unable to say that he had found new and uncommon animals. Instinctively, he tried to identify them with a well-known image. Cognitive science would say that he was determined by a cognitive model. He was unable to speak about the unknown, but could only refer to what he already knew and expected to meet. He was a victim of his background books, just like, I'm afraid, all of us. So we do carry books with us, and we are never innocent when perceiving new things. This is where we stand in this class, and this is what we aim to historically explore a bit more here. How the Europeans did this in relation to China. How the background books, the so-called background books, it's a metaphor, of course. It doesn't refer to actual books, okay? It's pre-established images, pre-established frames of interpretation, constantly oriented the way that Europeans understood things. Now, one topic that Eco discusses is the relationship between cultures and the way the two of them relate, two different cultures relate. One way of dealing with this, and one way that has dominated our knowledge and our understanding of intercultural contact for quite a while now, is represented by this book. The title of this book is Orientalism. Its author is a very, very famous scholar by the name of Edward Said. Notice the fact that the book is almost 40 years old. And also notice that this is its cover. It shows, it's a painting by Jean-Louis Léon Gérôme. It's known as the snake charmer. And it is typical for a type of art that was known even before Said wrote this book as Orientalist art in Orientaliste or Orientalisme in French art discourse. Basically, there was a passion for reproducing and showing images of the Middle East in French painting in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, and a bit earlier and a bit later as well. Now, Said offers us another version for understanding what I've just told you. It's a much more complicated text, and unfortunately we don't really have time to fully explore it. I will just move very, very quickly by focusing only on a few lines on these slides. The first one, I think, is also one of the most important ones. It's at the very beginning of Said's book. The Orient was almost a European invention. An invention. Not something that exists objectively. Not something that can be framed because somehow nature or God or something decides so. This is an important point, because basically this is what we are going to talk about as well. How Europeans constantly invented and reinvented China. This is what this course is about. Said continues, I shall be calling Orientalism a way of coming to terms with the Orient that is based on the Orient's special place in European Western experience. The Orient is Europe's cultural contestant and one of its deepest and most recurring image of the other. Remember that we talked about China as being one of the West's favorite others, if not the favorite other. Said talks about the Orient at large, specifically referring to what we call today the Mediterranean area, the Middle East and Northern Africa, as such another. In addition, the Orient has helped to define Europe or the West as its contrasting image, idea, personality, experience. This is a very important point, once again, because by learning about how Europeans perceived China, we are going to learn a great deal about Europe. Again, another reminder to those of you who expect this class to be about China. Once again, this is about perception. This is about representation. Orientalism can be discussed as analyzed as the corporate institution for dealing with the Orient, dealing with it by making statements about it, authorizing views of it, describing it, teaching it, settling it, ruling over it. In short, Orientalism is a Western style for dominating, restructuring, and having of authority over the Orient. To put it otherwise, be aware that you are likely to meet in this class texts that will not be nice to look at. We will find racism in this class. We will find a lot of self-assurance, a lot of a sense of superiority of the West, a lot of sense of entitlement that the West is best. The first part of this class is going to be much nicer from this perspective, because we will be dealing with a lot of things related to wonder,
how enchanted the Europeans were with the East.
The second part is going to bring us into close contact with a lot of unpleasant things, or more unpleasant things. You will, often students notice this, I warn you about this from the very beginning, okay? So be aware that when we get to the late 18th and mostly 19th century, we will learn very unpleasant things about the Europeans themselves, so to say. Now, I need to skip through all this. A typical, I can skip this as well. I will actually focus just a bit more on the very motto that Said picks up for his own book. He picks it up from a text by Karl Marx. So he takes an excerpt from a text by Karl Marx known as the 18th Brumaire of Louis Bonaparte. And the quote he picks up from the original is, "They cannot represent themselves, they must be represented." So he imagines the fact that, or he insists on the idea that the so-called Orientals, this is what he suggests, cannot express fully through discourse, and it was the duty of the Europeans to articulate them into existence through language. This is how we are meant to understand this, right? This is what it looks like. Notice the Chinese translation, and notice that the word represent is what you would expect. It's 在线. No problem here. Now, the funny thing about the original context, the context in Karl Marx, is that Marx did not understand the word represent in the sense of 在线, but rather in the sense of 代表.
So what he meant to say was that some people, French peasants and small landowners that were not yet a class, were in need of acquiring a voice politically. So what we have here is Said somewhat misrepresenting Marx through this quote at the very beginning of the book.
This brings us, or makes me emphasize yet another very important point here. Since we are in the land of representation, since we are in the land of vision, of perceptions, of imagining, of inventing, there is a lot of room for accident. There is a lot of room for mistake. There is a lot of room for layer after layer after layer of sense, of meaning. I really don't have time right now, but this is one of the most famous paintings in the world by Diego Velázquez. Probably some of you know it. Las Meninas. Discussed 100 times by art historians, discussed famously by Michel Foucault in a text known as The Order of Things, and which is a text, which is a painting about representation. Now, time is against me right now, but try to ask yourselves, what is it that we see here? Who represents whom? And mostly, who is here? Of course, if you really want to have some fun, then do read Foucault. Because Foucault does not analyze this painting in terms of art history, but rather in terms of epistemology and theory of knowledge. But it's a wonderful, wonderful introduction if you feel an interest in a good read for the issues we will be discussing here. More simple things, however, can appear through little images like this. Representation, self-representation, and so on and so forth. A little drawing, a little lithograph by Escher. And this is the very last series of things, a number of images that will become clear at the end. So it's quite clear what we see on the screen. A temple, we find out some tower over here. The sun god represented here, the altar of the moon, the altar of the stars, ladies and the way they get dressed, transportation. The queen in this land looks like this. This is how the king looks. Do you know what land we are talking about already? There's a viceroy's lady and the viceroy himself. Then we have a burgher who likes smoking, a country bumpkin just like a nobody who also likes smoking, a virgin, a bride. Notice that a bride has something like a, the sun decoration around her head, and so on and so forth. A married woman, a gentleman's nurse, a widow, country woman. Still don't know what country this is from? These are images from a book talking about a country. The viceroy's castle, a city house. This is a country where people actually don't spend much time in the open because it's much too hot. They tend to stay underground. A gentleman's balcony for traveling, a litter for transportation. This is money in that country. Anything familiar at all? Well, come on, this is your own island. This is Formosa. This is the Formosan alphabet. This is how Formosans around 1704 used to write. In case you wonder, you have here the title of the book, An Historical and Geographical Description of Formosa by a gentleman who was there. This was a Formosan himself. He called himself George Psalmanazar. And he was French. He went to London and he claimed to be, well, a Formosan. He shocked English people through his ways of eating. Basically, he didn't cook much of his meat and whatever other rituals he did. And then he convinced quite a few people that he was a real Formosan. And these people wanted him to write a book. And so he did. And of course, for a very short while, people really believed him, but then they started wondering. Finally, Psalmanazar, on the verge of being shown to be a fake, ultimately confessed to his trickery. So notice that we have many, many ways in which representation can happen historically. This is also a legitimate vision. So this is what this course is going to be about. Unicorns, from unicorns to charlatans, and from poets and painters like Shipping and Ezra Pound to travelers and wanderers like Marco Polo and many others. So if you decide to take it, welcome. I hope to see you all next week. If you have questions, ask me now or again by email anytime you want. I will need that list of names.